At 93 years old, John Wilson had lived a long and peaceful life. He had spent his youth serving his country in a distant war, but after returning home, he settled into a quiet life in a small town. The once loud and busy world of battle was behind him, and now he enjoyed the simple joys of his retirement. His days were spent in his cozy house, nestled among trees, taking walks, and remembering the old days with pride. For most of his life, John had been known for his calm demeanor. His neighbors respected him, and children in the neighborhood would stop by to listen to his stories about his time in the military. John wasn't just a soldier to them. He was a living history book. Everyone respected him for his kindness, his wisdom, and the way he had served his country. Even though his body had grown weaker with age, his mind remained sharp. He spent his days tending to his garden, enjoying the fresh air, and taking short walks down the quiet streets of his town. But one day, everything began to change. It all started with the sound of motorcycles roaring down the street. John, sitting on his porch with a cup of tea in hand, looked up to see a group of bikers speeding by. The noise was loud and aggressive, breaking the calm of his neighborhood. At first, John didn't think much of it. After all, motorcycles were common in the area, and the town was small enough that occasional noise was something he was used to. But the bikers didn't just pass by. They circled back, revving their engines even louder. They began to stop near John's house, making crude comments as they shouted from their bikes. John could hear the laughter of the men as they teased him. "Hey, old man, you need a ride," one of them yelled. They thought they were being funny, but John didn't find it amusing. He simply stood up, walked inside, and closed the door behind him. Over the next few days, the bikers came back, and their behavior grew more disturbing. They would park their bikes in front of his house, rev the engines, and make more rude remarks. One afternoon, as John was sitting in his living room, he heard a loud bang on the door. Startled, he opened it slowly to find one of the bikers standing there, grinning with a mischievous look. "How's the old soldier doing today?" he said, smirking. The bully's words stung, but John didn't show it. He didn't want to get involved in a confrontation. He had seen enough trouble in his life to know that sometimes the best response was silence. He closed the door quietly, not wanting to make a scene. But things didn't stop there. The bikers continued to torment him, making John's peaceful life feel more and more uncomfortable. He was being pushed around, not by physical force, but by their words and actions. John didn't know what to do. He had never been a man to back down from a challenge. But at his age, he didn't have the energy to confront them directly. His pride as a veteran, though, wasn't something he was willing to lose without a fight. He knew he had to find a way to end this harassment. But how could a 93-year-old man, who had seen so much in his life, stand up to a group of loud young bikers? As he sat in his chair, staring out the window at the bikes parked outside, John realized that there was one thing he had never forgotten from his military days. When there's a problem, there's always a way to fix it. And that was when he decided to make a phone call. For the next few days, the bikers seemed to take a particular interest in John. They rode by his house in the mornings and at night, always revving their engines loudly, shaking the windows of his little home. It was as if they were trying to make their presence known, but John didn't want to let them bother him. He had dealt with much harder situations in his life. Yet the constant noise and the taunting remarks were starting to wear him down. One afternoon, John decided to take a walk to the nearby park to clear his mind. It was a peaceful day, and he hoped the fresh air would help him forget about the bikers for a while. As he walked slowly down the street, he saw them again. The group of bikers were gathered in front of his house, leaning against their motorcycles, laughing and talking loudly. John didn't think they even noticed him at first. But then one of them spotted him. Well, if it isn't the old soldier," one of the bikers called out, his voice filled with mockery. John didn't answer, but he could feel the stares of the group as he continued walking, trying to ignore the rude comments. "Hey, you want to join us, Grandpa? You look like you could use some excitement," Another biker shouted, clearly trying to get a reaction out of him. John kept walking, his eyes straight ahead, but the bikers weren't finished. They followed him down the street, revving their engines loudly behind him. The noise was deafening, and John could feel the vibrations of their motorcycles through the ground. He tried to remain calm, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, but the taunts continued. "You don't look like much of a soldier anymore," one of the bikers sneered. "What's the matter, old man? Scared of a little noise?" The more they shouted at him, the more frustrated John became. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but these weren't the kind of people he could reason with. It wasn't like the battles he had faced during his time in the military. There were no clear rules or honorable opponents here. It was just a group of bullies trying to get under his skin. That night, the bikers returned again. This time, they were even louder, racing their bikes in front of his house, speeding up and down the street. The noise was unbearable. John sat in his living room, gripping the armrests of his chair as the sound of the motorcycles echoed in his ears. He could hear the bikers laughing and shouting, their voices full of taunts. "What's the matter, soldier? You going to sit in there all night, or do you want to come out and play?" John had had enough. His patience was running thin. He was a man who had seen the worst of things during his years of service, but he wasn't used to being treated like this. He needed to put a stop to it before things got worse. As the bikers continued their noisy harassment, John stood up from his chair, looking out the window at their motorcycles parked in front of his house. He was tired of feeling helpless. He had fought for this country, but now it felt like his home was being taken from him by a group of people who had no respect for anyone or anything. It was time to do something about it, and that's when he remembered the phone call. John sat in his old, comfortable chair, his hands resting on the armrests as he gazed out the window at the bikers still parked in front of his house. The noise from their engines seemed to echo in his mind, growing louder with every passing second. The loud revving, the taunting voices, it was all too much. For the first time in years, John felt powerless. But then something inside him stirred. This wasn't the first time he had faced a challenge. He had spent years in the military, overcoming obstacles that seemed impossible. He had been trained to face adversity head-on, to never back down from a fight. This wasn't a physical battle, but it was a battle of respect. And John wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. He thought back to his time in the army, the lessons he had learned, the values that had shaped him into the man he was today. Duty, honor, and courage. He had stood in the face of danger and fought for what he believed in. And now, he needed to stand up for himself, for his home, and for the peace he had earned. John's hand tightened around the armrest, his fingers digging into the worn fabric. He didn't have to fight these bikers the way he fought in wars. He didn't need to raise his fists or shout back. There was another way, a smarter way, and he knew exactly who to call. He slowly stood up from his chair, his bones creaking with the effort, and walked to the small table in the corner of the room. There, beside an old lamp, was the phone. It was a simple landline, the kind he had used for years, but now it felt like his lifeline to something more than just a solution to his problem. It was the key to restoring the peace he cherished. John took a deep breath, dialing the number he had memorized for decades. It rang twice before someone answered. "Hello," came the voice on the other end. It was a familiar voice, one he hadn't heard in years, but one that always brought him a sense of comfort. "Tom," John said, his voice steady but firm. "It's John Wilson. I need your help." There was a pause on the line before Tom replied, his tone filled with curiosity. "John, it's been a long time. What's going on?" John glanced out the window at the bikers once more before speaking. "I've got a situation here, Tom. A group of bikers is causing trouble, harassing me at my house. They've been doing this for days, and it's not stopping." Tom's voice turned serious. "You want me to send someone out?" John shook his head, even though Tom couldn't see him. "No, I need more than that. I need something stronger. I need you to do what you can to stop them." Tom, understanding the gravity of the situation, didn't hesitate. "I'll make some calls, John. Don't worry. We'll take care of it." John felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been right to call Tom. Tom was someone he had served with in the military, a man who knew how to get things done. John had no doubt that if anyone could handle this, it was Tom. With the phone call made, John sat back down, his mind clearer than it had been in days. He wasn't helpless after all. He had just needed a reminder of the strength he still had. The bikers had no idea what was coming their way. As he waited for the plan to unfold, John felt a sense of calm return to him. He had taken the first step, and now he just had to wait for the next move. John leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight lifted from his shoulders after making the call to Tom. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of control. The bikers outside his home had been tormenting him, but now he had taken the first step toward solving the problem. He trusted Tom, his old friend from the army, more than anyone. Tom had always been someone who got things done, and John knew that if he said he would handle it, he would. As John waited, he stared out the window, watching the bikers linger around the front of his house. Their loud engines continued to roar, but John's thoughts were far away. He was remembering his time in the army, the battles, the tough decisions, and the friendships that had kept him going. He had learned how to face any challenge head-on, no matter how impossible it seemed. The phone call with Tom had been brief, but it had made John realize something important. He didn't have to fight this battle alone. In the military, he had always had his comrades by his side. And now, even in his quiet town, he had someone who would back him up. John checked the time. It had only been a few minutes since he called Tom, but it felt like hours. The bikers weren't leaving. They seemed to be having a great time, mocking him and causing trouble. The longer they stayed, the more they disrupted the peaceful neighborhood. John could feel his frustration growing, but he knew he had to stay calm. The plan was in motion now. There was nothing more he could do but wait. Just then, the phone rang again. John quickly picked it up, his heart beating faster. It was Tom. "John, it's done," Tom said, his voice steady and confident. "I've made the calls, and I've arranged for a few people to come by. You won't have to worry about them anymore." John couldn't believe it. In just a short amount of time, Tom had taken action. The feeling of relief was overwhelming. "Thank you, Tom," John said, his voice full of gratitude. "I knew I could count on you." "Don't mention it, old friend. Just stay inside and stay safe. We'll handle it from here." As John hung up the phone, he felt a new sense of confidence. The bikers had no idea what was coming. They had picked the wrong person to mess with. John wasn't just a retired soldier. He was someone who still had connections, someone who still had respect. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. He watched as the bikers continued to loiter outside his house, laughing and shouting to each other. They didn't know it yet, but their time was running out. John didn't want to fight them. He didn't want to make a scene, but he was ready to do whatever it took to protect his home and his peace. John sat down, his fingers resting on the armrests of his chair. He felt the weight of the situation lift from him as he thought about the help that was on the way. He had faced many challenges in his life, but this one felt different. It wasn't about being a soldier anymore. It was about standing up for himself in a way he hadn't expected to. But he was ready, and he knew that this time, things would be different. John sat back in his chair, staring out the window at the bikers who were still hanging around his house. Their motorcycles were parked in front of his yard, engines idling loudly as they laughed and shouted at each other. But John wasn't worried anymore. He had made the call, and now it was time to let the plan unfold. The quiet town that John had lived in for so many years had always felt like a peaceful haven. But these bikers had turned that peace upside down. They had no respect for anyone, especially not for someone like John, who had served his country faithfully all those years ago. They thought they could push him around, that they could intimidate him into silence. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Tom, his old friend from the military, had promised that help was on the way. John trusted him. Tom had been there for him in the past, and he had always kept his word. If anyone could take care of this situation, it was Tom. And now, John had to wait. It was hard for John to sit still. His whole life, he had been a man of action, always ready to move when there was a problem to solve. But this time, the solution wasn't in his hands. It was in Tom's. He had to trust that things were being taken care of, even though it felt like the bikers were making his home their playground. As the minutes ticked by, John's mind wandered back to his military days. He remembered the long nights spent in training, the difficult missions, and the times when he had to rely on his comrades for support. They had faced many challenges, but they had always found a way to overcome them. John had learned how to keep his cool in the most intense situations, and he knew that this was no different. He wasn't going to let these bikers get the best of him. Suddenly, he heard the sound of sirens in the distance, the unmistakable wail of police cars. John's heart skipped a beat. He knew that Tom had delivered on his promise. Help was finally here. Through the window, John saw several police cars pull up to the street in front of his house. The bikers had no idea what was happening. They continued to joke and shout, unaware that their time was running out. As the officers got out of their vehicles, John saw the bikers stand up, confused by the sudden arrival of law enforcement. The officers moved toward the bikers, who began to backpedal. Some of them started to rev their engines, clearly unsure of what to do next. But the police were not intimidated. They were calm, professional, and ready to handle the situation. John watched from his window as the officers spoke with the bikers, their voices firm but not aggressive. The bikers didn't seem to know what to make of the situation. They were used to getting away with their behavior, but now they were facing the consequences. As the conversation continued, John saw a few of the bikers' faces change, realizing that this was no longer just a game. John felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't over yet, but the bikers were being confronted, and that was all he needed. He had trusted Tom, and Tom had delivered. Now the situation was in the hands of the law. The peace that John had worked so hard to maintain was being restored. He sat back in his chair, a quiet smile crossing his face. The bikers had underestimated him, but they had learned an important lesson today. Respect is earned, not taken. The sound of sirens still echoed through the air as the police officers walked toward the group of bikers. The bikers, who had once seemed so confident and intimidating, now looked confused and uncertain. They had been used to causing trouble without any consequences, but this time, things were different. The presence of law enforcement was something they hadn't expected, and it was clear that they weren't sure how to react. John watched quietly from his window as the officers approached the bikers. He had always respected the law, and seeing it in action made him feel a sense of relief. He had been right to trust Tom. The situation was being handled, and he didn't have to lift a finger. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm demeanor, stepped forward and addressed the group of bikers. "We've received reports of disturbances in this area. You need to move along," he said, his voice firm but not angry. The bikers, still unsure of what was happening, looked at each other, exchanging uncertain glances. They weren't used to being told what to do, especially not by the police. One of the bikers, a man with a leather jacket and sunglasses, tried to protest. "We're just having a little fun, officer. No harm done." But the officer didn't flinch. "You've been disturbing the peace. It's time to leave," he repeated. The tension in the air was thick. The bikers, who had once felt like they could do whatever they wanted, were now faced with authority. Some of them grumbled under their breath, but none of them dared to argue further. They knew better than to escalate things with the police. Slowly, one by one, they began to mount their motorcycles. John's heart settled as he saw the bikers start their engines and drive off. It wasn't over yet, but they were leaving. And that was enough for now. The peace he had been fighting to protect was slowly returning to his neighborhood. The bikers, once a threat, were now retreating. He sat back in his chair, watching as the last of the motorcycles disappeared down the street. The police officers remained for a few moments longer, talking among themselves, making sure the situation was completely under control. After a few minutes, they got back in their cars and drove away, leaving the street silent once more. John let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The situation had been tense, but it was finally over. He had taken the right step by calling Tom. And now, the bikers knew better than to come back. He stood up from his chair and walked over to the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow over the street. It was a peaceful evening, just like it had been before the bikers started their trouble. John felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had faced this challenge with dignity, and in the end, he had won. As he looked out at his quiet neighborhood, John smiled to himself. He wasn't just an old man in a small town. He was someone who still had the strength and the connections to stand up for what was right. And that made all the difference. The bikers were gone, and the peace John had fought so hard to protect had returned to his quiet street. As he stood by the window, looking out at the empty road, he felt a quiet sense of relief. The sun had set, and the soft glow of the evening filled the air. It was a calm, peaceful night, the kind that John had enjoyed for so many years. But tonight, it felt different. He had earned this peace, and that made it feel even more precious. John turned away from the window and walked slowly back to his chair. His legs felt a little weaker than they had earlier, but that didn't bother him. He had faced the challenge head-on, and now he could rest. As he sat back down, he found himself thinking about everything that had happened. It had all started so suddenly. The bikers had come into his life like a storm, breaking the quiet, peaceful routine he had worked so hard to build. At first, John had been uncertain about what to do. He wasn't used to being pushed around, but he was also old enough to know that not every battle needed to be fought with strength. Sometimes it was better to rely on your connections, your wisdom, and your calmness. It was a lesson he had learned years ago during his time in the military. He remembered the training, the discipline, and the camaraderie he had shared with his fellow soldiers. In those days, he had learned to never underestimate the power of a well-thought-out plan. And that's exactly what had happened today. John smiled to himself as he thought about Tom. His old friend had come through, just like he always had. Tom had been there for him when it mattered most. It wasn't just the help he had provided. It was the reassurance that John wasn't alone. In his older years, John had become used to his own company, and while he had no problem being alone, there were moments when having someone to rely on felt like a weight lifted off his shoulders. John had spent many years fighting for his country, and while he no longer wore a uniform, the values he had carried with him remained. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. But he had also learned the importance of using wisdom and patience to handle situations. It wasn't always about physical strength or confrontation. It was about choosing the right path. As he sat in his chair, John reflected on the life he had lived. He had seen a lot in his 93 years. He had fought battles, made sacrifices, and lost friends. But he had also gained a deep sense of peace. He had learned to cherish the quiet moments, the small victories, and the simple pleasures of life. The doorbell rang suddenly, pulling John from his thoughts. He stood up slowly and shuffled to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see a neighbor standing there, holding a plate of cookies. "Hi, Mr. Wilson," the neighbor said with a warm smile. "We just wanted to make sure you're okay after all that noise today. Can we offer you some cookies?" John smiled and nodded. "Thank you," he said, accepting the plate. "I'm just fine. Everything's settled now." As he closed the door and sat down with the cookies, John realized that the trouble with the bikers hadn't just been about protecting his home. It had also been about protecting the peace and respect he had earned over his lifetime. And in that moment, he knew that no matter how old he got, He would never stop standing up for what mattered most. The sun had fully set now, and the quiet of the night filled the street. John sat in his favorite chair, sipping his tea and feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in days. The bikers were gone. The police had handled the situation, and now everything was back to normal. He could almost hear the gentle rustling of leaves in the trees outside, the calm that had once been interrupted now restored. But he knew the bikers hadn't just disappeared without a trace. They had been humiliated, sent packing by the police, and John could only imagine how they were feeling now. They hadn't expected that response, not from a man like him, an old retired soldier. They had thought he was an easy target, someone they could laugh at and push around. But when they had gone too far, they realized that he wasn't just any old man. John had connections, experience, and most importantly, the will to stand up for what was right. The next morning, as John stepped out to get his mail, he saw a familiar face approaching. It was one of the bikers. The man looked different today, not like the cocky figure who had mocked John just days before. This biker was walking slowly, his face somber. He wasn't wearing his usual leather jacket or sunglasses, and he wasn't with the rest of the group. John could tell right away that this wasn't a casual visit. There was something about the way the man walked that made it clear he had something serious to say. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," the biker said, hesitating as he stood a few feet away. I wanted to apologize for how we acted the other day. We didn't know who we were messing with." John raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, waiting for the biker to continue. "I'm sorry for the trouble we caused. We thought it would just be fun, you know. But after everything happened, I realized we went too far. It was wrong," the biker said, his tone sincere. "I didn't mean to disrespect you or your home." John nodded slowly, his expression calm. He had no anger toward the young man. After all, he had been where the biker was, young, reckless, and sometimes without thought for the consequences. John wasn't going to hold a grudge. "I appreciate your apology," John said, his voice steady. "But remember, respect is something you earn. It's not something you can just take. You learn that as you grow up, whether you're in the army or just living your life." The biker nodded, his head lowered slightly. "I understand now. And I'll make sure the others do too. I don't think they'll be coming back here anytime soon." John didn't respond immediately. He just gave the biker a small smile, a silent acknowledgement that the situation had been handled in the best way possible. He didn't need to force anyone to respect him. The bikers had learned their lesson, and that was enough. The young man turned and walked back down the street, his head still lowered, but there was a change in his step. He had learned something that day, something that would stay with him. John watched him go, his heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. The conflict had been resolved peacefully, and not through anger or force, but through understanding. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon you could use wasn't strength, it was wisdom. With a quiet sigh of relief, John turned back toward his house. The street was peaceful once again, and he was content knowing that he had stood his ground, and in the end, had helped someone else learn a valuable lesson. The days passed, and life returned to its quiet rhythm for John Wilson. The bikers had stayed away from his neighborhood, and the uneasy tension that had gripped him just days earlier had disappeared. He went back to his routine, taking walks around the block, tending to his garden, and enjoying the peacefulness of his little corner of the world. John had always appreciated the simple things in life. He didn't need excitement or noise. What mattered to him was his home, his memories, and the respect of the people around him. It had been a long time since he had faced any real challenges, but the recent events had reminded him that even in his older years, he still had the strength to defend what mattered. It wasn't just the bikers who had been affected by what happened. The whole neighborhood seemed to have taken notice. People had heard about the situation and how it was handled, and they respected John even more for the way he had dealt with it. He hadn't fought with anger or violence. He had called for help when he needed it, and when the time came, he had stood his ground. He had shown that even in a quiet town, respect should be earned and never taken for granted. John never bragged about what happened, but he could see the change in the way people looked at him. Neighbors greeted him with more warmth, and people who had once barely nodded to him now stopped to chat for a few minutes. There was a quiet respect in the air, as if everyone knew that John wasn't just another elderly man. He was someone who had lived a full life and had learned what truly mattered. One afternoon, as John sat on his porch enjoying a cup of coffee, his neighbor, Mr. Harris, came over. He was a middle-aged man who had lived next door to John for several years. John and Mr. Harris hadn't been particularly close, but lately Mr. Harris seemed to be visiting him more often. "Mind if I join you for a moment, John?" Mr. Harris asked, smiling as he stepped onto the porch. "Not at all," John replied, gesturing to the empty chair next to him. "Pull up a seat." Mr. Harris sat down and looked out over the street, which was peaceful as always. After a few moments of silence, he turned to John. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what happened with those bikers. I've lived here for years, and I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that the way you did." John chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. "I just did what I had to do. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about standing up for myself and for what's right." Mr. Harris nodded. "That's exactly it. You didn't go looking for a fight. You stayed calm, called for help, and when it was time to act, you did. You showed a lot of people around here that there's strength in keeping your cool." John smiled, feeling a quiet pride in his words. He had never been one for seeking praise, but hearing it from someone else felt good. It reminded him that what he had done was more than just about protecting himself. It was about setting an example for others, showing that kindness and wisdom could be just as powerful as anything else. As Mr. Harris stood up to leave, he gave John a respectful nod. "I think we all have a lot to learn from you, John. Take care." John watched him walk away, feeling the sense of peace settle in his chest. The bikers may have come and gone, but the respect that had grown from that experience would stay with him, and with everyone who had witnessed it. He turned back toward his porch, the warm breeze rustling the leaves in the trees, and thought to himself that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in battle. They're won through wisdom, patience, and the ability to stand tall, no matter the odds.